Okay, we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 2 through 16 this time. 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. I have heard about this. This is the section on the veil issue. Before we even get to the text, I want to remind us of some things that we need to be bringing to the text from other places in the Holy Scriptures. First one being this, some introductory points. Let's go through this. If you've got the workbook there, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Number one, introductory points. A, the veil is a secondary issue. Put that down. The veil is a secondary issue. The bigger issue is the issue of being in role. It's the issue of subjection or being in role. That is the, here's your next blank, primary issue. That is the primary issue. I love McGuigan's got an article on, it's a 3-part article, not too long. It's like a page each. So it's 3 pages basically. And it's on something about hats at Corinth or something is how it's titled. Funny little title. He basically says, do you think that Paul spends 15, 16 verses talking about a hat at Corinth? The issue is bigger than that. It's not about the head covering. It's not about the veil. It's about, that is a symptom. That is a sample. That is a representation of the issue, the big issue, which is whether or not men and women, both are in role. This will not be the only time he brings up this issue. In some ways, he actually reserves some of that discussion for chapter 14, but he kind of saves it for a later discussion and kind of merges the two together, sandwiches them up a bit. Here in 1 Corinthians 11, he specifically talks about this issue of the veil. And it is a sample of a broader issue, the issue of being in role, role-ness. Men have roles, women have roles. Paul needs to say something about it. Corinth has a mess with this. Number 1B, the veil existed before Paul came to Corinth. Rick Oster, professor of New Testament at Harding University, more or less established this. There was some doubt, and some brethren are just, I'm not trying to be rude, they are naive in thinking that the veil issue is a church matter. It is not. The veil was a cultural artifact. The church issue comes into how does the church react and respond or relate to culture. But the veil was a cultural artifact. Now, to make that clear, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where am I here? 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 16. 1 Corinthians 11:16, he'll say, if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. Which is his way of saying the church doesn't have legislation on veils. This is not our deal, Paul says. The veil issue is a secular, secondary issue, but the church needs to know how to respond to culture. In 1 Corinthians 11, also, he has this little, this is really little, but it speaks loudly. On 1 Corinthians 11:6, if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. Why the little word if? Condition. If it's not a cultural problem, if it's not a custom of the culture, then the woman doesn't have to react in a way. The male doesn't have to react in a way. But if there is a custom, then the church needs to know, because of the bigger picture, we need to respond to that custom or culture appropriately. Roy Deaver had this to say, if it is known, well known, that in Texas, all prostitutes carry red handbags, I would advise women to stop carrying red handbags. If that's the culture down there, that prostitutes carry red handbags, stop carrying red handbags. That's Paul's word on the matter. So here's the issue that Paul's bringing up. It's more than just a veil. It's the issue of being in role. If we know that women wear skirts, women wear dresses, and that is the culture, that is the custom, the saint has a response. Men better not be wearing dresses and skirts. That's the argument Paul's making in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We as Christians need to conform not to godless culture, but to neutral culture. If culture has rules or ways set up, stop looking weird and causing harm to the cause of Christ. Paul actually says where you can fit in, fit in. Stop trying to buck culture and look in the part of some social rebel, social anarchist. He is saying in 1 Corinthians 11, we need to be where the culture is neutral. We need to react appropriately towards culture. And so the veil issue was a secular deal. Women wore veils. It was essential female attire. And Paul says this was a secular issue. The church didn't make this up. It existed long before he ever came to Corinth. Number 3 then, or 1C rather, in this location and era, this location in Corinth and this time, in the Greek culture at this time, veils were an, put this, essential part of the female attire. Veils were an, your blank is essential part of the female attire. If you were female, you wore the veil. That's how it was. To shirk or to ditch the veil would be to reject not just a veil, but it's actually a sign or a symbol of rejecting your femaleness, your femininity. And so he says if you reject that, you're actually going against the very structure that God set up. Men be men, women be women. You're made to be men and women. And Paul's in a large way here even addressing transgenderism, by the way. You need to react towards the calling in which God placed you. If you're male or if you're female, you need to function as you're set up. So more on that here in a moment when we unpack the text. The fourth thing then, D, we've got 4 subpoints or 5 subpoints under it. Customs change. Cultural customs change. What if in 1,000 years suits are actually inappropriate attire and the culture has just taken us that way? Well then, I suppose if it's inappropriate, Christians need to say, well, we're not going to wear that business. It's not about whether or not you're modest. It's actually immodest because the culture has taken it. It's not appropriate attire or whatever. What about words? What about cultural words that have changed or customs that have changed? Used to mean that the word ass used to mean donkey. Now, its standard definition has taken on a little bit of a different meaning. Culturally, there's been a shift. All I'm pointing out is that culture does shift or change. Some of our brethren had a fit when they came out with women's pantsuits. Culture changes. It's not that you're rejecting your femininity, your femaleness by wearing a pantsuit. Some of our brethren thought that. But the culture changes, and we need to go along with neutral culture where we can. That's the point Paul's making. Don't be a cultural rebel or anarchist and actually wind up rejecting your role that God called you to be in. That's what the veil is going to tell us about. So, D1. Since the customs change, we need to observe this. Number 1, D1. 1D1. The Jewish high priest had a turban. Oh, you mean to tell me that the Jewish high priest covered his head? That's what it says. That's what it says. The Jewish high priest had a turban. D2. David prayed with his head covered. Oh, isn't that striking? That'll be formative here in a second. In 2 Samuel chapter 15, you'll remember he's on the run from his son Absalom, who wants to usurp the throne. Absalom wants to usurp the throne. And so David is on the run. And in 2 Samuel 15:30, David went up on the ascent of the Mount of Olives. He wept as he went. His head was covered, and he walked barefoot. The people went with him. Verse 31, someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. Watch this, with his head covered. 31. David said, O Lord, I pray, make the counsel of Ahithophel foolishness. David prays with his head covered. That is striking. And it will become extraordinarily important as we unpack 1 Corinthians 11, about verses 4 and 5. Okay, D3. Jewish males did cover, your blank is cover, their heads. There was what was called, it was like the turban. It was called the talith. It was a shawl wrapped all around the head. Jewish males even wore that. That's what the culture was. They did. They certainly did. D4. Women at Corinth. This is setting our context up now for 1 Corinthians 11 a bit better. In 1 Corinthians 11, women at Corinth were out of role R-O-L-E. They were out of role, and they were using the veil as a means or a vehicle to demonstrate the rebellion of their role. They'd come together and they'd say, let's ditch the veil. Let's ditch our head covering. And why? To show a sign of their radical feminism, to show that they're not subject to men. Paul is going to say, in this custom, in this context, a veil is an essential part of the female attire. You ditching it, whether the men are present or not, is a sign for something bigger that's going on. It's not about the hat at this point. It is about them saying we're rejecting our female role-ness. And that's Paul's issue. You're rejecting God's structure or setup for who you are and who your identity is as a female. You're out of role. He's going to say the same thing to the males. And then, number 5, 1D5, prior, the veil had been the attire of a harlot. So custom certainly changed. Genesis 38, you've got Tamar there who's wearing the head covering as a prostitute's attire. So it's interesting that we observe these cultural things before we even come to 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul's going to speak about it in a very specific Corinthian context. Okay, let's go to the text now, and let's read 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Let's actually do 2 through 16. I'll read it. 1 Corinthians 11, beginning in verse 2. Now I praise you, because you remember me in everything, and hold firmly to the, interesting word here, traditions. He says they held firmly to the traditions in a good way, noble way, just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand, verse 3, that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. The word head there suggests something about authority or authority is good. Headship is good if we understand what we mean by headship. When he says Christ is the head, man is the head, God is the head, we just need to understand what he means if we use the word headship. It suggests something about authority. There is authority embedded within the term. More on that in a second. Verse 4, every man, male, that is, every male, every masculine fellow who has something on his head physically, every man who has something on his head physically, while praying or prophesying, disgraces his head. Just in passing, what was going on with the Jewish high priest? David prayed with his head covered. The Jewish males wore the talith, this turban. What's going on? How can Paul then say, who is fully aware of the Jewish custom and he's fully aware of his Old Testament history, how can Paul say in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 4, every man who prays with his head covered disgraces his head? More on that here in a second. Verse 5, but every woman who has her head uncovered, if the woman doesn't have the head covered while praying or prophesying, she disgraces her head. For she is actually the one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. She's cut off all of her hair. She looks the part of a cult prostitute. More on that here in a second. So Paul's saying that the man needs to make sure his head isn't covered. The woman needs to make sure that her head is covered. What's Paul talking about? And could our prayers not make it to God if we as men have a ball cap on when we pray? And if the woman just doesn't have hair because of cancer, is that a problem? That's not really what Paul's talking about. There's a context here, and if we forego the context, we're reading the wrong text. We're not reading the text for its own merit here at this point then. We've got to keep the context in mind. More on that here in a second. Verse 6, for if a woman does not cover her head with the veil, that is, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. Okay, think about that. If she doesn't cover her head, Paul says, go the whole way with it. Just chop your hair off. But if there's this custom that it's disgraceful that she has her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she better wear the veil. What's going on here? What's Paul talking about? The veil is in context. The veil, this issue, the secular artifact, this cultural artifact of the veil is certainly driving our context here. Verse 7, A man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man. Man better not cover his head, Paul says. He's the image and glory of God. Woman is the glory of man. He's not saying woman's not the image of God. He's simply making a distinction, and there are some different roles here. Woman also takes this integral part in being the glory of man. More on that in a second, of course, too. Verse 11, man doesn't originate from woman, but woman from man. He's back in Genesis at this point. Where did the first woman come from? The rib, right? Man was created first, then the woman. That's his argument. Verse 9, indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman was created for the man's sake. That is not a remark that's chauvinistic. That's not Paul saying that woman is second in, let's say, inferiority. She is not inferior. He is making an argument about chronological priorness. He's saying this is just simply how it was. Man existed first. God said, you need a helpmeet. He created woman. Woman came second, not as inferior. She came second as in chronology. Verse 10, therefore the woman ought to have a symbol of authority. The woman ought to have authority. Literally, the Greek text just says the woman ought to have authority on her head. The translators are right to say a token or a trinket or a symbol. The woman needs some kind of trinket to suggest authority on her head because of the angels. Tricky little phrase. Verse 11, however, in the Lord, as a Christian. Is that what he means? Or is he saying, probably rightly, adverbially, God's order of things, the scriptural authorized way, verse 11, is that neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. Verse 12, for as the woman originates from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman. And he gives us this, verse 12, all things originate from God. We need to keep Genesis in mind here. On verse 3, and then verses 7 and following, Paul is drawing on Genesis 1 through 3, the Genesis narrative, the Genesis structure. His argument is based in a Christian worldview that stems out of Genesis 1 through 11. He is not just going off the cuff. He is drawing on the structure set up in Genesis. Okay, take a look at verse 13. That's a critical argument, by the way. In 1 Timothy 2, it's a critical argument. In 1 Corinthians 14, it's a critical argument here. The structure of Genesis is driving, and it was for Jesus, Matthew 19. Haven't you read at the beginning that he that made them male and female? That's what he said. He's drawing on the Genesis setup and structure. Verse 13, judge for yourselves. This is an appeal to their common sense. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Verse 14, this is tricky, does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him? What does he mean when he says nature should teach us that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor? I wonder about some of those fellows, particularly Samson and others like him who were put under what was called the Nazirite vow, Numbers chapter 6. I'm interested in how God allowed, even God was the one who came up with the Nazirite vow. Do not cut your hair. Males, it's talking about. I find it interesting that the Nazirite vow was drawn up by God, who says you do not cut your hair. What if somebody would have said that Nazirite vow business is ungodly, even though God's the one who gave it? Doesn't nature teach us that man should not have? Maybe something else is going on. If we think about people like Samson and other people under the Nazirite vow, I think we've got a question that we've got to come up with. We've got a question. What does Paul mean when he says it's a shame? Nature teaches us that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor. Verse 15, more on that, of course, in a moment. Verse 15, but if a woman, on the other hand, has long hair, it is a glory to her, For her hair is given to her for a covering. And this has led some incorrectly to say, well, the covering that he's talking about here is hair. More on that in a moment. That's inaccurate. That is highly inaccurate. Verse 16. But if one is inclined to be contentious, Paul says somebody wants to go on this point a bit. We have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. Paul is talking here about roleness. Paul is talking about roleness. He is using a smaller issue, the secondary issue, the peripheral issue, the veil, the hat, the head covering, to talk about a much bigger issue. He's not writing all these verses about a hat, folks. He is writing these verses about being in role and subscribing to the Genesis worldview for humanity, what man is and isn't, and what woman is and isn't. That's what Paul's writing about. And Corinth, these former pagans, screwed up by worldliness, are now in the church. And they're bringing baggage to the church. And Paul says, we've got some things about the male identity and the female identity that need to be addressed. Could you see, and this is happening in our culture, could you see people who are transgender, homosexual, coming to church and wanting to stay as transgender homosexual people? Now, that's a cultural deal that we've got to wrangle with. There's a lot more to say about this, but Paul is addressing that kind of thing as people seek to re-identify themselves in a calling that actually is quite apart from Christ and the worldview that's set out by Genesis 1 through 11. And that's the issue that Paul's targeting here. He is simply using this smaller mechanical issue, the head covering, the hat, the veil, to address it. We need to keep that in mind. Now, with that in mind, let's look at our workbook. Number 2, Corinth was told to hold to the Christian traditions. I think it's quite plausible when he says, hold firmly to the traditions as I delivered them to you, that he is talking about Genesis, the Genesis worldview. Genesis particularly 1 through 11, or particularly Genesis 1 through 3. He says, hold to the traditions that I delivered to you. The context, as he's going to show here, he goes back to Genesis 1 through 3. That's what he argues in verses 7 through at least verse 12, 7 through 12. He's going to make his argument. His big argument comes out of Genesis. So I wonder if when he says hold to the traditions, he's actually talking about the tradition, which is the reading of Genesis 1 through 3 as the paradigm by which we ought to adhere. Now, number 3. He says Christ is the head. All 3 of these blanks are the same. Christ is the head of the man. The man is the head of the woman. God is the head of Christ. The word head, and I've got it there in the Greek, in number 3, is the word kephale. Kephale. Some of our liberal scholars, experts, professionals have tried to take this word kephale and say, it doesn't really mean head. The word means source. That is wrong. That is wrong. The word kephale does not mean source. It means head. Why would they want to say source rather than head? Here's the issue. Source doesn't carry with it this idea of authority, but head does. Paul's point is, to some extent, about authority. And so the radical feminist crew has tried to redo the word to say that man is not actually authoritative over woman in any sense. And that in relation to authority, men and women are on the same plane. That is incorrect. There is a, quote unquote, pardon this expression, but just the one I'll use, chain of command. And Paul is saying that in the chain of command, man is authority over the woman. He is not talking about man being superior and woman being inferior. He's going to actually rebut that in verses 7 through 12. But what he is talking about, yes, come on out, buddy. Yeah.
I'm all done with school.
Okay, let me go about 30 more minutes and then we'll go, okay?
I'm coming out here.
No. Go back in. Okay. Thank you, buddy. Thank you. We'll go in about 30 minutes. Close the door back, please. Thank you much. Okay. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 7 through 12. He's going to rebut this idea that woman is inferior and man is superior. He is not being chauvinistic. He's not being dictatorial. Paul is saying that there is a chain of command. There is an authority and man is over. Just in the same way that God is over Christ. He's the Father, Christ is the Son, but that doesn't mean that Christ is inferior or lesser of a God than the Father is. They are equal in status. It says in Philippians 2, 6, and 7, he did not say it was robbery to say, I am equal to God. Philippians 2 and verse 7. Similarly, man and woman are equal, but they have distinct roles. In their roles, man is the supervisor, the top of the chain of command. That's how it goes. And Paul's going to make argumentation for that. But it doesn't mean that woman's inferior. She has a different role to play. Similarly, because woman has a role, it doesn't put her over the man. It doesn't mean that woman's up here and the man's inferior. Well, woman is the one to bear children. It doesn't make her greater than men. She just has a different role to play. And that's how nature itself teaches us. That's part of Paul's argument. Man is the authority over the woman, just as God is over Christ. But it's not talking about equality as being eroded, as if one is then an inferior and the other is a superior. 1 Corinthians 11:3. Kephale involves authority. Number 4, Paul's point about the male's wearing of a veil is hypothetical. Look at verse 4. He says every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. Were they doing that at Corinth? Were there men at Corinth who were wearing something on their heads while praying or teaching, prophesying? I think that is purely hypothetical. Paul's not talking about a baseball cap, though, is he? He's not talking about the Jewish talith, the turban. He is talking specifically about a female veil. And Paul says, don't think that only the women can be out of role in relation to this. Cross-dressing men, too, can be out of role. If they take female attire and they wear this business and they pray or prophesy wearing the female attire, cross-dressing, they're out of their male role. Ironically, at the end of the letter, he'll tell them, act like men. 1 Corinthians 16:13. I wonder if our generation today needs that word. Act like men. I read Dr. James Dobson in his book, Bringing Up Boys, where he talks about the nuclear family is highly under assault right now. And what they are attacking is our young men. That is completely true. He's a clinical psychologist. Dr. James Dobson tells us that the number one assault right now is on our young men. Striking. Why do we need men? Because if men learn how to act like appropriate men, not dictators, not tyrants, not jerks, not fools, but we learn how to act like Christ, would you believe that the feminist issue is going to sort its business out? I think so. If we teach women how to act like women, appropriate women, do you think that the men might sort their business out? It's going to be perfectly found in the revelation from God, which teaches us how we ought to be as men and how we ought to be as women. An imbalance is going to wreck us all. And that's what we've got going on. 1 Corinthians 11:4, this idea of men wearing the female veil is purely hypothetical, but he's making the point that men can be out of role just as easily as the women. Okay, so number 4, it's hypothetical. On number 4, the males, let's do this. Paul uses the point to demonstrate how a male could equally, as the female, be out of role. His meaning of the remark about males disgracing their heads by having it covered, in light of those introductory points, is that the males swapping roles, those are your next blanks on number 4, swapping roles via the veil, the female veil, is out of place. A male's use of female attire is a rejection of his, next blanks, it's a rejection of his role/headship. On number 4, a male's use of female attire is a rejection of his role/headship. Now let's look at verse 5. Every woman, on the other hand, who uncovers her head does not use her essential female attire, the veil, while praying or prophesying, disgraces her head. For she is the one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. Here's your blanks on number 5. Both veillessness and a completely shaved head on a female is her ditching her female attire. It's her rejecting her role. She's saying, I'm not doing the feminine thing. I'm going to take on a different identity. I'm going to reshape my identity. I'm going to reject my femininity. Number 5, both veillessness and a completely shaved head would be out of place on a female, that is. She's rejecting her essential female attire, the veil. Paul's point is to show that a rejection of the female role, taken the full way then, would endorse female shaving of their heads. Verse 6, if it is disgraceful, it may be that a woman's haircut could be shorter, and that's perfectly fine in a culture. But if she does, in this context, Paul says, in the context at Corinth, they have this setup. If you've got shorter hair as a woman, you need to be wearing the veil. You need to be covered. It's a sign of your role. In a culture where it's not, there is no such thing as females needing to wear hats, veils, and a shorter haircut on a gal is fine. Paul says that's fine. That's not what he's talking about here. He's talking specifically about the Corinthian context. And that's why he uses that word if on verse 6. If it is disgraceful for her to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, she needs to wear the veil. But if it's not a custom, she has liberty then. The culture doesn't dictate her on this, apparently. But in this context, the culture does make some decisions. Now, let me see here on chapter 11 and number 6. Number 6. This is critical. I'm going to just be brief here, and we'll do more with it in 1 Corinthians 14. On number 6, the assembly of 1 Corinthians 11:5. Number 6, the assembly of 1 Corinthians 11:5 must be an all-female assembly. Put those blanks down on number 6. The assembly in 1 Corinthians 11:5 must be an all-female assembly. Now, you could press me on that, and you'll get your chance. Well, no, you won't, because 1 Corinthians 14 will be via video also. Let me just assert my views. If you want to press me on it, shoot me an email. 1 Corinthians 11:5 says this: every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. Now, how do we know that this is a public atmosphere would be one question. Well, it has to be public because she is prophesying. What does that involve? She is teaching someone. So it's somewhat public. But could a female be praying publicly and therefore also subsequently prophesying publicly over the man? Paul reserves that issue for the woman taking the lead over the man. He reserves that issue for 1 Corinthians chapter 14. He also says a bit about it in 1 Timothy chapter 2. Let's hold that question in suspect for the moment. Paul is clear on 1 Corinthians 14, the female is not supposed to take lead over the man. And that has a specific context. There are 3 requirements in order for that to happen. 3 requirements in order for a female to be out of line by taking authority over the man. We'll talk about those on 1 Corinthians 14. Just know that there are 3 requirements for a female to do that. Let me rattle them off very quickly here. In order for a female to usurp authority over the man, it has to be, number 1, in an assembly context. Number 2, it has to be a mixed assembly. Male and female need to be present. And number 3, it would have assembly context, mixed assembly, and 3, the female would have to take the lead. The female would have to take the lead. Here's what I mean to say. If the female is in an assembly, it's males and females present, but she's talking from the pew, then she's not taking the lead. And 1 Corinthians 14 is going to tell us she's not to be guilted on that. She can make a comment. She can be audible in the assembly. Why? How do you think she sings, for pity's sake? She can be audible in the assembly, but she can't take the lead. Take the lead in an assembly context with males present, but she can still talk. If she takes the lead, it's in an assembly context, males are present, she's out of role, she's out of line. Paul will talk about that in 1 Corinthians 14. Well, think about this. What if it's not a mixed assembly? What if she does take the lead? And what if it is an assembly context? People are gathered for prayer and prophesying, talking, teaching, public teaching, but there are no males present. Not a problem. She's not usurping authority over the man. The man's not present. Or what about the first one? The female goes to the microphone, and so she takes the lead. Men are present, but she's making announcements at a football game. It's not an assembly context. In order for a usurping of the masculine authority that Paul has in view in 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 14, and 1 Timothy chapter 2, you've got to have all three of those components present. And 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy chapter 2 will bear this out. I'll say more about it on 1 Corinthians 14. If you do not have an assembly context, males and females present, and the female taking the lead, then you don't have a usurping authority. All three components have to be present. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians 11:5. It's obviously public because she's prophesying. That implies that there are people that she's teaching. Other people are present. Paul says every woman who has her head uncovered, she's ditched her veil, while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. So it's public. I think that the assembly here, if there were males present, Paul would say she's usurping authority, she's out of role. That's not what he says. He doesn't criticize the woman here for praying or prophesying. Instead, he criticizes them for ditching the veil. Now, this is important. Can we imagine a scenario where a female could be in lead, praying or prophesying? It's an assembly context and males not be present. I can give you at least two from Holy Text. The first one is in Exodus 15. Listen to this. In Exodus 15, they've just crossed over the sea. Moses and Miriam sing this new song, and it says in Exodus 15, beginning about verse 20, Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took the timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and with dancing. She pulls the women aside from the congregation and leads them in song, 15:21 says. So there's one instance, Old Testament, but this is taken out of the Genesis narrative, by the way. This structure is not new with Paul. Women not taking the lead over the man is actually old. It goes back all the way to, Genesis, and that's Paul's argument that he'll make. But there's a context there in Exodus 15 where it's an all-female assembly. There's another one. In Acts chapter 15, I'm wrong, Acts 16. Acts chapter 16 and verse 14, there was a woman named Lydia, Acts 16:14, from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple fabrics, a worshiper of God, was listening. The Lord opened her heart to respond to the things spoken by Paul. Paul meets up with Lydia. Where did he find her? Go back up to 16, verse 13. On the Sabbath day, listen to this, Acts 16:13. We went outside the gate to a riverside where we supposed that there would be a place of prayer, and we sat down and began speaking to the women who had assembled. Interesting. It's a female assembly. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians 11:5 again. Paul says that if a woman in an assembly context who's in leadership role, she's taking the lead, she is praying or prophesying publicly, she's leading the prayer, she's leading the prophesying, so there are other people involved. He says the problem he's got is her ditching the veil. What's going on here? Here's what I think. If we're reading between the lines, I think that we've got women at Corinth who have something like a ladies' day, something like we're about to have at Cherokee. It's all females, but they are taking the veil, which is their essential female attire. It is a token, a trinket of their femininity. And they come together in an all-female assembly, and you've got some of these women who are out of role, and they're saying, let's take this veil thing and rid ourselves of it. After all, we're women in Christ, and we have freedom. And they are abusing They are using an abusive view of freedom, Christian freedom. Christian freedom is a reality, but it needs nuance. And that's Paul's whole point. It's still nuanced by the gospel. When he talks about freedom, it doesn't mean that we're free from all law. He says that in 1 Corinthians 9. He says it in Galatians 5 and 6. He says it all over the place. When he talks about freedom, he's not talking about you have moral freedom to go out and fornicate and lie and cheat and steal. Freedom is still boxed in a bit. And Paul says we're now enslaved by love, which is even more, it has an even bigger calling than what we had formerly thought. Now, in 1 Corinthians 11:5, why would these women want to ditch the veil? I think that they are using an abusive form of Christian liberty or freedom to say that we can ditch our roleness. And Paul goes back to Genesis to say, you're going too far. Gospel, Christian freedom, leaving paganism behind to become free in Christ doesn't mean that we're free from all, pardon the expression, but rules. We're free from any standards. And the females have gone too far, and they've rejected the very Genesis substructure or Genesis structure of male and female identity, how God called them to be the image of God. I think that you've got out of role women at Corinth. And Paul says, don't only think, though, that the females can be out of role by ditching the attire. Men can be out of role, verse 4, by taking on female attire. I think all of that is coming up in 1 Corinthians 11. Now, let me read one more passage. This is Titus 2. What should the women, if they have a female assembly, a ladies' day, what should they be teaching? Titus 2:5 says that the women, the older women, ought to teach the younger women, 2:4, to love their husbands, love their children, be sensible, be pure, be workers at home, be kind, be subject to their own husbands, so that the word of God will not be dishonored. If you have a ladies' day and the head speaker on the ladies' day, who has the right to lead women in an assembly context, but she doesn't have the right to usurp over the men if there were men present. But in a ladies' day context where there's an assembly and she has the right to take the lead and do the speaking, would be wrong if she tried to lead these women to violate their role. What the older women need to be teaching the younger women is how to be subject and in role. And at Corinth, it looks like they're subverting that and doing exactly what is opposite. Now, this brings us to number 7. Paul does not treat the female as inferior. Man, and when he says man on verse 7, he's got a bigger picture in view. Man, he's talking about the male. Man, the male, ought not to have his head covered with the female veil, is his point. Since he's the image and glory of God, the woman is the glory of man. Verse 8, man does not originate from woman from the man. Indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. Put this blank on number 7. Both male and female are made in the image of God. Genesis is too clear about that. But there's another interesting thing about Genesis 5, 1 and 2. Adam wasn't completely, he didn't experience fullness of human without his counterpart Eve. That's why they two become one flesh, the text has it said. Together, male and female become all that is human. Male only experiences 50%, the male angle, of what it means to be fully human. He doesn't experience fully the feminine part. Same with the female. She doesn't experience the fullness of what it means to be masculine or male. But together, the two blend to be all that is man, human. And Genesis 1, 26 and 27, and Genesis 5, 1 and 2 makes that point. Both of those passages make that point. Paul goes back to Genesis and says, it's not about an inferiority, superiority thing. Both are made in the, and here's your blank on 7, the image of God. Paul's point now does become about the diverse, here's your next blank on number 7, roles of the masculine and feminine genders. We have roles. I'm sorry, but that's just how it is. And what happened to us following the science? You know, all the people who said follow the science in relation to COVID, number 1, didn't follow the science in a lot of ways. If you need evidence on that, hit me up. Number 2, the same people who said follow the science then stopped following science when it talks about what is man and what is woman. Interesting. biology is a tricky little thing, isn't it? Well, I suppose it is when you've got a bias. Listen to this. I don't know if you know about Prager University or not. It's not a school. Prager University is they're talkers. These are scholars or whatever who are more on the right wing of things, and they take a conservative angle, and they're trying to combat this left wing proposition and left wing propaganda. Listen to this. One of the liberal types criticized Prager University, who calls themselves Prager University, and they commented on Prager University's page and said, identifying as a university, calling yourself a university, doesn't make you one just because you say so and believe it. Well, Prager University is not that nonsensical. They know they're not a university in the way we understand the word university. They're talking about being a think tank. But anyway, Prager University responded, clapped back to the liberal who said, just because you call yourself a university doesn't make you one. They said, you're exactly right. Now do gender. And the point is, the liberals are trying to identify you can be whatever you want to identify as. There's no real objective standard as to what makes man man or what makes woman woman. You can be whatever you identify as, whatever you dream yourself to be. Paul is cutting against that and saying there is some objective criteria for what makes you man and what makes you woman. This text addresses the identity crisis that we're facing sexually and otherwise today in our culture. Paul is not talking about hats. Listen to me. Paul is not interested in hats. He is interested in hats, female, male attire, as an emblem, a sample of a much bigger issue, maleness and femaleness. That's Paul's interest, and he uses this little mechanical issue of the veil to kick the doors wide open and have the discussion. Let's move on to verse 10. The woman then, in light of Genesis, ought to have authority on her head because of the angels. I think that's a tricky little phrase. You need to look at the commentaries on that, but I think I've done my homework. On 1 Corinthians 11:10, when he says that the woman ought to have a little trinket or token of authority on her head because of the angels, I think he is drawing on the fallen angels of 2 Peter 2:4. There's some tricky stuff going on in the Genesis narrative, and some of it I'm sure of what to make of, and some of it I'm not sure what to make of. In 2 Peter 2:4, you got this little line that says this: if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness, reserved for judgment, ... I think he goes back to Genesis again and sees the fall of Satan and the goons, the angels, because of rebellion. What is the sin that Paul is confronting in 1 Corinthians 11 via the veil? He is confronting female and potential male rebellion to their roles. Now, let's look at 11:10 again. When he says the woman ought to wear her veil, have this trinket or this symbol of authority on her head, in this context at Corinth, she ought to wear the veil. And it is because of the angels. I think he is drawing on those fallen angels and saying, if you reject your appropriate role, just like the angels rebelled and rejected their role, you run the risk of falling out with God too. Listen to Jude 6, which is similar to 2 Peter 2:4, and comments on such a thing. Jude 6 says, and angels who did not keep their own domain, but became out of role, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. What will happen to us if we reject our role? If we are out of role? It looks like to me Paul is saying the same judgment could be incurred upon us, males or females, if we reject our roles, as happened to the angels who fell out with God because of their rejection of their role or their rebellion. That's what I think 11:10 has in view. So put down on number 8, she's supposed to have a symbol of authority on her head. This symbol is because of the angels. Because of the angels is your next blank on number 8. All right, let's look at number 9. This is verses 11 and 12. In the Lord, that is, in the way that God set things up, after scripturally or after his authority, it's the appropriate structure. That's what 11:11 has in view. In the Lord, neither woman is independent of man. How far do you think the female race is going to get if all of the males were extinct? Well, woman's not independent of man is his point. Look at 11:11 again. Neither is man independent of woman. How far do you think us males are going to get if we are if we had an extinct female sex gender? In both cases, the males or the females, you get about 100 years maximally. If we had all of the males, even the infants, we had all the formula we needed to give nutrition to the infants. Whether males, if for the females, they had all the breast milk in the world they needed to feed these infants. The infants that are alive today, if we cut off one of either the males or the females, the infants only get the best is about 100, 105 years, maximally 110. You don't have independence of the other, is Paul's point. They are, here's your blanks on number 9, both sexes are mutually dependent. Both sexes are mutually dependent. He says that in 11, and then in verse 12, he reminds all things originate from God. It's not a question of inferiority or superiority. It is a question of role-ness. And Paul discerns from Genesis there are roles that the males and females have to play. Distinct. They're equals, but they have distinct roles. And that's Paul's argument. And Corinth, it seems, is cutting against that, ditching it in some ways. Paul says that's a problem. So 11 verse 12, all things originate from God. That's your next blank on number 9. All things originate from God. Now in verse 13, this is number 10 in the workbook. Judge for yourselves. It's an argument to common sense. Your blanks on number 10, common sense. He appeals to common sense. Make the judgment yourselves, he says. Think about it. Is it proper for a woman in the Corinthian culture, that is, to pray to God with her head uncovered? Can she just ditch the veil? Think about it. You know how essential it is in this culture and day and this time. Paul says, can she just ditch the veil? What do you think? Common sense. They know it's an essential part in that culture. It's an essential part of the female attire. No, she cannot. She's ditching her role. All right. Verse 14. So you got common sense on number 10. The word nature. Look at verse 14. And I've got the Greek word there for us, phusis. Phusis. The word nature, phusis, can mean, here's your blank, long-standing habit. Long-standing habit. Second nature. What do you mean when you say second nature? When I had the guys in class in 1 Corinthians last time around, I took one of the expo markers in the middle of class. I'm almost done, okay? Almost done. I took one of the expo markers and tossed it to Robert Taylor. And would you believe this? Listen to this. I didn't tell him, didn't warn him. I was standing in the middle of the room, took it and threw it his way. Would you believe, without being told, without any kind of alert, he looked at the marker and caught the marker. Now, why did he do that? It is habit. It is second nature. It's one of those things, it's like a blink. If something's coming at your eye, you can't help but flinch, whether it's close your eyes or you turn away from it. It is a nature, second nature, habit. And look at the lexicons. Don't just take my word on this. Do one at one point in your life. Do when you get the chance. I mean, after you're out of school and you're not so bogged down with all this stuff that's going on, especially right now. Look up in Thayer's or Kittle's or whoever you use, Perschbacher, whoever you're using for your lexical work. Look up the definition for phusis and see if they don't all go the way of, it can have a meaning of second nature or long-standing habit. What's the point? Paul isn't discerning from nature itself. Boys need short hair. Again, our preliminary points that we observed. What about Samson? What about the Nazirite vow? And aren't we told that the culture of Jesus' own day was that most of the males had longer hair? I think this. I think I know it. I think I know it, but I think it too. I think that the Corinthian culture was a shorter-haired culture. Why do I think that? Well, there's some narrative evidence too. In Acts chapter 18, you guys remember the map? Do I have a map in the workbook? I think I do. If you go back to the workbook and look at the introduction to the Corinthian epistles. Look at this. Look at this. I've got this map on our intro. If you find Corinth and Cenchrea, they're like 4 to 10 miles apart, right there in the little inlet. Cenchrea and Corinth, just a couple of miles apart. Now, what's my point? Catch this. In Acts chapter 18, Paul was at Corinth. Paul was at Corinth. And it says, that's what 18:1 says. He was in Corinth with Aquila and Priscilla. Now watch this. On 18:18, Paul, at Corinth, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren, put out to sea for Syria, and with him were Priscilla and Aquila. And then we get this little remark. In Cenchrea, just a hop, skip, and a jump down the road from Corinth, he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. Interesting. What was the vow that Paul took? He takes another similar vow in Acts chapter 21. Now, I think this. Modification is not the right word, but I'll use it. I think that Paul takes a modification or a lookalike of the Nazirite vow. I do not think that Paul sins in Acts 18 nor in Acts 21. He's too clear in Galatians, which he's already written by this point. He is staunch against going back under the old law as a means of justification. It's like circumcising Timothy, Acts 16. He does a number of things, becoming as a Jew to the Jews to try to get through to them, not to be so socially offensive. He is not taking a vow as a means for salvation. He's not circumcising Timothy as a means for salvation. He is trying to cut down the social offense that would be had. Now, here's the interesting thing. In Acts 18:18, Paul had longer hair. That's what 18:18 just said. He had been under a vow. Why? Socially good for the Jews. He shows up with the longer hair. It's the Jewish culture. It's the Jewish context. But when he gets to Cenchrea and Corinth, it says on 18:18, he cut his hair, for he had a vow. He had been under the Jewish vow with the long hair. He goes now to a Grecian culture where it's socially polite to have the shorter hair as a male. You know what he does? He gets a trim. He goes to sport clips. Why would he do that? Back to 1 Corinthians 11. He knows there's a context here at Corinth. It is socially right for Paul to cut down the offense of going to Corinth with this longer hair business. He knows their culture. He knows their context. He shows up and tries to cut down on all of that as much as he can so that the gospel might go forth. He says in 1 Corinthians 11:14. Now let's get back here. 1 Corinthians 11:14. Doesn't standing habit at Corinth, don't you know your Greco-Roman culture? Doesn't it even tell you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor? They, in that culture, Paul says, had short hair. And he too goes along with it and gets a haircut. Acts chapter 18, verse 18. Now, let's get our workbook. The word phusis can mean long-standing habit. The point is, number 11, long hair wasn't always, Nazirite vow, Samson, innately or inherently a dishonor or a shame to the males. Even God endorsed long hair on males at times, and I've got some references there in the workbook. Paul's point is that a male's wearing of a female hairstyle is out of role, and it's an out of role rejection of his place as the female's rejecting her role with the veil. Here's the point. Can the males be out of role by wearing the female clothing, veil, by wearing a female hairstyle? I'm not keen on this ponytail business. Man buns? Is that stuff right for a Christian to have? Now, here's the thing. If the culture changes, then Christians have an okay to go ahead and change with the culture. But in a culture where that stuff is reprehensible, males don't wear dresses. You better not be a Christian, at least right now, wearing a dress. Then if the culture changes, then the culture changes. I mean, they used to wear tunics, used to wear long robes. It's perfectly permissible if the culture has it set up that way. We aren't to be rebels. We're not to be social rebels or anarchists. And that's Paul's point. Doesn't the nature, doesn't the habit, doesn't the second nature, long-standing practice in the Greco-Roman culture teach you that the males in that context just have short hair? That's Paul's argument. So yeah, you can be out of role in a context, in a culture, when you just do bizarre things that cuts against the culture. Now, Let's get number 12. And this is verses 14 and 15. Verse 14, if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him. If a woman has long hair, it's a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. Now, this is a bit tricky. Pursue this. Read McGuigan on this, who's really good on this. Number 12, the word hair can be either from coma or thrix in the Greek. Two different words for hair. The word hair is from coma, which carries the connotation of an ornament rather than biology. Paul is treating the hair in this context as if it were an ornament, something attached to the person rather than integral to the person, him or herself. Think about that. The point he's making is that his concern is about roles and how we fall into line or do not fall into line. We do not subject ourselves to roles. We rebel in relation to roles. Do you subject yourself to the role you're in or not? Paul's point is you can do that via a hairstyle. Males can do it. Females can do it. He said that point back in chapter 11, 4 through 6. He's saying it again now on 11, 14, and 15. So when he says hair, he's talking about it as an ornament rather than something integral to who the person is. You can use the ornament rightly or wrongly, and he's advising we use the ornament of hair rightly. Now, look at this on verse 15. It says, her hair is given to her for a covering. More than one person wrongly has said, there you have it. The veil is not an ornament. The veil is not some secular cultural artifact. The hair is actually the covering. Wrong. Paul is talking about a secular cultural artifact. This needs to be made note of. Look at number 13. When he says the woman's hair is the covering, he's got the word parabolion on verse 15. Not the same word if you look back at 11:7. Man ought not to have his head covered. That word is the word katakalupto. He's not talking about the veil when he talks about the covering of verse 15. You need to pause the video perhaps and think about that. Earlier, he is talking about an actual covering, an ornament, a piece, an artifact, a societal, cultural artifact. On verse 15, he is saying that the woman's hair is a covering. He's not saying that the hair of the woman is the veil. That's not what he's saying. He's saying it somehow covers her. Now, let me go back. Let me go back to 11:7. Look at this. Look at 11:7. A man ought not to have his head covered. Now, let's think about this. He actually said, verse 4, if a man prays while having his head covered, 11:4, 11:7, he's wrong. Think about this. If he's saying earlier in the chapter that the veil is the covering, a male is wrong for having hair. Think about it. If a male prays or prophesies while having his head covered, and if the covering is simply having hair, then any man with hair is wrong. We would all need to be bold. Is that Paul's point? It's not Paul's point. The word on 11:7, covered, is a different word in the Greek text than the one on 15. Covering. Let's go back to 15. What's his point? Tough to know. But 11:15, when he says, for her hair is given to her for a covering, the best I can come up with is he's saying that woman and her hair, he's not talking about cancer patients. When woman has hair and it's longer and it even wraps around, I think he's making a point that kind of covering around the face symbolizes, there's your next blank on number 13, her hair should symbolize her covered approach of being less aggressive and less assertive. It's the best I can come up with. If it's not right, then I'm not sure what to make of it. But in 11:15, when he says her hair functions as a covering, I think he's saying it's symbolic. I think he's saying that wrapping around of the hair and the longer hair covers her more than the male does. And it says something symbolically about her less assertive and aggressive way and nature. A woman that's more aggressive and assertive often is out of role. Do we have to have a fine line where we draw that? In some areas we do. Paul will address that in 1 Corinthians 14. But also we read about the quietness of the woman and how laudatory that is in 1 Timothy. Listen to this in 1 Timothy chapter 2 in verse 12, 11, 2:11. Well, let me just pick at it. 2:9. They need to adorn themselves discreetly. 2:11. Quietly the women should receive instruction. 2:12. She is to remain quiet and not exercise authority, usurp over a man. Now, all that's in an assembly context. But I think there's a truth there in some ways, too, about her being modest and discreet and quiet-natured, even outside of an assembly context. Now, Paul's not as dogmatic on that. He doesn't make that point. He simply says that the woman should not be that way in a mixed assembly. She should not take the lead in a mixed assembly. She is to quietly receive instruction and be in role. 1 Timothy chapter 2. He says the same thing in 1 Corinthians 14. But I would add in 1 Peter chapter 3 that there's something about the quiet-natured woman. This is 1 Peter chapter 3. Women, be submissive to your own husbands. Win them over. 1 Peter 3:1. They should observe your chaste and respectful behavior. 3:3. Your adornment, the way you dress and conduct yourself, not just dress, but your whole persona, your whole character, shouldn't just merely be external, braiding hair, wearing gold jewelry, putting on dresses. Let it be, listen to this, 1 Peter 3:4, the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. There is something wrong with an aggressive, loud, out of role woman. Even outside of the mixed assembly, we need to be very cautious if we are female about whether or not we are in role and being wise about the way we conduct ourselves. Paul's point on 1 Corinthians 11:15 may have some of that in view. Her hair is symbolic as it wraps around and suggests something about her less assertive or aggressive approach. Last thing here, verse 16, one inclined to be contentious. We have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. Number 14 in the workbook. In conclusion to the difficult unit, it's worth recognizing that a male can be out of role by two ways. Number one, a male can be out of role by wearing a female's veil. That's what verse 4 says. If there is a female's, in our culture, a dress, if a male wears a dress, he's out of role. It can be done by clothing, or two, by wearing a female's hairstyle. If the males start wearing things like ponytails, man buns, we're on shaky ground culturally. We need to make sure our culture's cool with that, and we're not looking reprehensible, anarchist, rebellious in that. Males, too, can be out of role. That's what he says. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 4, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 14. If a man wears either attire or hairstyle that's not masculine, he's out of role. Can the female be out of role? Absolutely. How can she do it? 14. Second down there at the bottom, 14:1, by rejecting female attire. Verse 5, she ditches her head covering, the hat. That's essential female attire in this culture. If she ditches that, she's out of role. She ditches female attire. Or, and this one he reserves for later. It's not just attire though, is it? There's actually a third thing. Attire, hairstyle. What if she shaves her head? Cuts all her hair off. If the culture said she could be out of role. She could be out of role by wearing a male hairstyle. Bald, that good on females? Paul says if the culture's not good with that, then you better not do it. And number two, taking the, here's your next blank, lead in church. If the female takes the lead in the assembly, and Paul does not address that here. He's wanting to stay on the issue here about roleness. But later he's going to get into the issue of if she takes the lead, she's out of role in that manner as well. What is the issue? What is the primary issue in 1 Corinthians 11? Hats? Head coverings? No, that is a sample. That's a representative of the bigger issue of worldview. And the worldview that Paul's seeking to endorse is the one in Genesis. It's about the very structure and identity of humanity. And he says males and females need to retain their identity as males and females, not rebel and reject their identity. They need to be subject to their roles and conform themselves to the pattern of Genesis. And did they have a problem with that at Corinth? That's why he tells them act like men. That's why he tells women act like women. He's saying all of that in 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. We'll pick it up in the next video in 1 Corinthians 11, 17 through 34.